loudest, make some noise for Evelyn. With that, I give the stage to you. Enjoy. Good luck. And enjoy, folks.
All right, thank you. So my talk is basically, as you see, about convergence on platforms. So before I get into it, quick question, sort of a quick poll. How many people have been in tech for longer than 5 years? Raise your hand. Oh, nice. Like longer than 10? 20? OK, good. All right. That's fine. So really, just so you just kind of get a good gauge of how familiar you are with kind of the history of things, I'll go into it. So first off, about myself. So basically, I live in Munich, Germany. I'm from Sudan. Actually, my parents are from Sudan. I grew up in America. My biggest hobby is actually roller skating, as you see here. If you know anything about roller skating, you know that I have spent way too much money on this. This pair of skates costs about 1,000 euros. Dead serious. It's kind of an unhealthy habit, but everybody loves it. It looks so cool. All right. And yeah, I've been so basically roughly 20 years in tech. Last 8 officially in leadership, but before that I was already kind of doing a bit of like leadership within teams across organizations all over the place. And I'm currently now the head of platform at NMAC, where Europe's largest energy trade marketplace, based in Germany, serving customers across Europe. Now, so if we kind of go all the way back to like the 80s, roughly the 90s, looking at how software development functioned, where kind of like everything was still started like on-premise. So basically, you had like data centers, you had computer labs, you had like a decimal environment, and you had sort of like dedicated teams for individual functions. So we had like you had a team of system administrators, you had a team of database administrators, you had your mainframe administrators. You also had your developer team, your QA team, and so on and so forth. And so at this time, we're roughly with waterfall. Basically, you had the development cycles were kind of led strictly by the business requirements, where they basically would talk to a customer. They'd be like, tell you what they wanted. They'd be like, OK, great. We're going to kind of like figure out how to do this. It was a dedicated business unit. And then once they had the requirements, they kind of delivered the product. So like, yeah, we can do this in about 6 months or so. And then that's then turned into actual requirements. What's the plan? Hand it over to a development team who kind of works on it. Then QA steps in. They see some like issues. They kind of send it back. Hey, there are these things. I can fix it. They're like, great. OK, now kind of talk to the database administrator. Hey, we need some databases. Like, OK, let's set it up. And then they get to delivery. And you finally have a customer who's very confused. Because what they needed 6 months ago versus now doesn't really apply anymore to them. Or the market changed and needs something different. So a lot of times it ended up with a very dissatisfied customer. Or when you said 6 months, it actually took you 9 months. So still with a dissatisfied customer. We also kind of look at how the teams were actually set up. This time you had like different touch points. Each team has to talk to the other team. And so as a result, the product owner kind of like check in with each one to look on the status and the progress updates. So for them, they're talking to basically like 4 separate teams. In the reality, every team talks to the other team. You have communication systems all over the place. It's a highly inefficient process. So what you could do is you kind of take a product manager, put him in the middle. They're in charge of this project. They're going to facilitate everything around that project. Well, actually, really, the reality is, you have a bunch of silos. Because the product manager only knows what's happening at that point when they would talk to them. So it's still fairly inefficient. And basically, we say that working in isolation back then, but really we're talking about it's actually silos. So we kind of move forward, and we see the invention of like the internet. E-commerce takes off. Basically, modern internet kind of creates this really fierce competition where suddenly you need to deliver features a little more rapidly. And this traditional waterfall process kind of shows a bunch of bottlenecks. The organizational structure can't really support this. And as a result, kind of like as the organization tries to react more quickly, they still kind of want this control, and it doesn't quite support it for them. And this is around the time that the Agile Manifesto was released, around 2001. And one of the people who signed it was Jeff Sutherland, who was basically the creator of Scrum. And so everybody here knows about this. You have your basically focus on smaller deliverables and shorter release cycles. You have your sprints and your planning and prioritization, which, in theory, when adopted properly, it actually means that you actually are able to like, react more quickly to requirements, what happens in the industry, what happens in the marketplace, innovations. But we look at our company that had this dedicated business unit around planning. We got waterfall Scrum. So you see, we still had that requirements gathering phase. They talk to the customer, and then they hand it off to this delivery team, who actually then they work within their agile processes to deliver the project, and they hand it over to the deployment team, system administrators, who then say, okay, great, we're ready to release it. Goes back to the product manager, goes back to the customer, says, hey, we delivered it, and like, okay, but this still took longer than you actually planned for. And they said, what are you talking about? We're doing Scrum. We're doing Agile. Which is not really very functional, because really it's basically the organizations have to break down those silos so that can just kind of come together and form something akin to Voltron, so to speak. So we kind of think more as kind of time moves on, and people start to figure out, like, oh, actually, we can't really stick with waterfall. I'm ignoring scalable agile framework. That is a horrific beast, because product owners didn't want to let go of waterfall. And basically, we kind of started to see that DevOps was sort of like being adopted. We're kind of developers, we're given like the tools and ownership of the processes to actually really kind of create and develop. We have like these 4 guiding principles. Okay, you have like the holistic thinking. Okay, let's actually think about all the different connected areas of the system, get rid of those silos, and we kind of create this feedback loop where it's kind of like you understand the impact of every single change. And a lot of that is powered by automation, because if you have proper automation, then you know what's happening within your system. If you know what's happening within your system, it facilitates and fosters better collaboration and more conversations around how to actually improve what you're doing. But as we saw, they took one role and they rebranded it as DevOps. So there's a nice little talk earlier about this. And so what ended up happening is you created a DevOps team who talk to the developers. And the DevOps team, they own the actual tools, they own the deployments, and you have this lovely silos again. So then you think, okay, actually, it doesn't really quite work when we have these silos, because that prevents like this rapid conversation, this feedback loop doesn't quite work. So let's take the DevOps person and stick them inside the development team. What do you have? Another silo. Because the truth, actually, is that the developers are focused on the actual development of the product. This DevOps engineer, system administrator, operations engineer, whatever you want to call it, they own the actual deployment. Because really what it is, all the developers turn to this person, hey, we need you to make sure this builds. Like, okay, I'm going to make sure it builds. Okay, now we need to make sure you deploy to production. Okay, I'm doing production. DevOps engineer says, hey, this broke in production. The developer's like, okay, what's the error? Like, okay, this is error. It's a whole back and forth, back and forth. It's very inefficient. We've heard this called like throwing things over the wall. You basically you drop it and run, because it might be a ticking time bomb. We're not really sure what it is. But overall, really, because that was always the issue, is that you kind of we focused on saying that this was a role. And as a result, we're not really restructuring. We're just changing the name of a specific cycle. So now we're saying we're doing DevOps, where really we just kind of took the deployment phase and rebranded it. So you kind of see how we still have, overall, the waterfall structure kind of struck in, because really the business is kind of driving the requirements phase, the planning phases. And even though you might have these sort of you often kind of hear in large enterprises where they say we actually work like a startup inside the enterprise. The reality is that they work as a startup within an enterprise, because once you leave this team that's working in a startup form, it still is a very rigid structure, kind of set up to actually look at having this rigid roadmap going further than 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever you want to call it. And then there's other ways of working that we heard. We have some conversations around it today, yesterday, so like the Spotify model, team topology, cloud center of excellence. I do want to mention that each one of these, except for the last one, that was a mistake by AWS, they all, in theory, function well. But when there's a need for control and actually full influence of the actual processes, it falls apart. So actually, I worked with a startup once that said they adopted the Spotify model. So they had guilds, they had chapters. And I asked, okay, how do you ensure autonomy? How do you make sure they're actually all functioning well? And the response from the EA was, well, I'm involved in every single meeting and all the processes. I'm like, okay, well, you're not doing Spotify. You're just doing micromanagement with more steps. He didn't like that answer. Okay, so now that I kind of brought you to modern times, we're going to jump back a few 100 million years to talk about convergence. Stay with me here. So you might have noticed the crabs kind of popping up. So let's look at one of them. This is the beautiful blue porcelain crab. I want you to take a moment to kind of like take in how gorgeous this is. It's got this nice, flat, round carapace up there. It protects like the soft undershell. You know, it basically really offers great protection. It's got these beautiful claws. But there's one thing. This isn't a crab. It's called a crab, but it is not a crab. Because you see, there's this beautiful evolutionary theory that different species over millions of years evolved to kind of develop characteristics that are similar to a crab, called carcinization. And we look at different crabs. You know, we have like, you know, the spider crab, we have the porcelain crab again, the hermit crab. They're all called crabs, and they look like a crab, but none of them are actually crabs. If you look at comics, you'll be familiar with this one. We often see like kind of the joke where it's like everything eventually evolves into the ultimate form of a crab. But truly, it's basically that convergent evolution is a process basically over time. Similar features evolve in different, you know, completely unrelated species because there are certain influences or evolutionary pressures that kind of like give them this benefit of like, hey, if I actually adopt, you know, flatter carapace or crab, or basically a crab like claws and pincers, this actually helps me out. Now, let's go back to modern times. Let me click on that again. There we go. So, think about what I just said about crabs and evolution. So, organizations, they always transform, they always change in order to actually deliver more value, to remain competitive within their markets. So basically, they prioritize the needs and the value, what they can provide to their customers. And if we kind of look at like what happens, you know, within those organizations when they prioritize the needs of their customers, they don't really care about like, what standards they have. They want to make sure they deliver to them. So if you look at like two different development teams within one organization. So one, they chose Node.js. That's what they work with. Their CI/CD is Circle CI. And then another one, dev team, Capricorn, you know, they use Scala and Jenkins because, you know, that works really well for them. And then let's look at a startup, for example. Click. One more. There we go. Yeah, so you have like one team that's like, we're going to use Scala. Yeah, and Azure works really well, so you're going to use Azure. And the sec team is like, no, Kotlin, that's the future. We're going to use AWS because I really see a lot of people using AWS, great ecosystem. We're going to use EC2 to make sure we have performance. And the last team is saying, you don't need Kotlin. You can go traditional Java. That works really well. We'll say AWS, but you know what? We want to use containerization, so we're going to use Kubernetes. Each team had an actual justification and rationalization behind their choice, which in one way, you know, you see like, okay, yes, we're prioritizing innovation, but actually what you're saying is you're prioritizing experimentation. And eventually what happens is you have these like what's called essentially knowledge overhead. Now you have like basically three completely different technical requirements for each of your products. So as a result, when you're trying to hire talent, you're actually looking for people who know all three of them, who know multi-cloud. You're actually restricting innovation because suddenly now when you actually want to develop more changes, you have to think about all the different libraries and dependencies you have with each product you've actually developed. You're also kind of risking stability because now you actually have to maintain across multiple platforms, multiple tech stacks, what do you want to call. Your developers are going to get stressed out and probably have a breakdown. So let's think about what would happen if we actually kind of looked at how do we standardize. So we say, OK, we're going to stick with one language, Node.js, and use Jenkins. In order to support that, you have to establish what your standards are. We say, this is our standards, and our process is for CI/CD. And from there, both teams can actually develop whatever the solution they actually need, as long as they stick with these standards. Because really what you're prioritizing is to kind of reduce complexity and what we call like the economies of speed. You know, you take all of these larger pieces that don't change very often, and you kind of build some internal processes. You build an internal platform around it. So that way, as you go higher up, you can change those things out more easily. So that allows the developers up top to actually say, we're going to build lots and lots of different types of services, you know, actually be able to react more quickly to the environment because we don't need to think about all of these larger pieces of the puzzle. And so it's really kind of about, like basically reduce complexity. You kind of want to have like, kind of centralize what we call the decentralization. And so in the end, basically, organizations, they're creating solutions for common challenges, kind of to democratize through a common platform. Another way to think of it is they'll seek to establish a common platform. Another way to think about it is unrelated organizations, without really wanting to, they are going to converge on a platform. Many, many organizations, it's not a sign of maturity over the organization. It's sort of a sign of like the growth trajectory of the organization. I've seen organizations based like large enterprises that finally start thinking about a platform, or startups actually kind of thinking about it, because then suddenly they have like many, many different solutions. They actually need to kind of like create a standardization, or they're trying to innovate very rapidly. And that's when they hit that bottleneck of like when we value experimentation over standardization, we actually inhibit the innovation aspect. And so when we think about, kind of you're creating this platform, you're bringing, a bunch of people together, trying to build a common platform to work together. When you think about all these people working together, they have a common purpose and a common goal, increases innovation. And in the end, you create Crab Voltron. Going to make stickers of this for our next conference, by the way. So let's think, what does it mean to succeed with platforms? Because oftentimes we see that when somebody builds a platform, they either see it actually have like strong adoption, or it starts to kind of like suffer a bit and actually kind of like limps along over time without really creating strong adoption that it needs. So let's think about what we kind of define this platform. You have different components. You have like your infrastructure, you have your observability, you have your tooling, your CI/CD, you have your developer products, you might have some metrics built into, you have a data lake. So it's all these like tiny parts, and you kind of combine them, they create this platform. Or more easily thinking, that second line, you want to allow your users to build the right thing the right way very quickly. You don't want to spend time thinking about how to do it, or talking to people, try to figure out what the right process is, or wait for a response. And I often say this is actually, if people often ask me, like, well, what is a platform? I always say it's interfaces. It is basically taking all those complicated technologies that you need to actually operate a product or deliver a solution, and you're just creating abstractions. Now, it's very important to actually think about it as more abstractions versus illusions. An abstraction is really basically, I'm telling you, this is a process that we're going to use. You can understand what's happening behind that process. Now, if we're talking about illusions, I'm going to say, here's a button. You push this button, you're going to get your product. And you ask, okay, what does the button do? You're like, it doesn't matter. You just push it. I'm like, okay, well, I want this product to be delivered this way. I'm like, it doesn't matter, it's still a button. That's the difference between abstraction and illusion. You want to actually kind of listen and kind of think about, you want to let people actually see how, like, what's happening behind the scenes, so that actually they're more invested in adopting it and working with it. And that allows the creation of applications. There's something that is often said. Gregor Hope, he's a great senior principal architect from AWS. Loved AWS, but he wrote some terrific books. You can see Platform Strategy. It's a phenomenal book. You should read it if you can. But something it says is that if your users surprise you with what they're doing with the platform, you are succeeding with your platform. You want them to be able to innovate, create interesting solutions. You want them to actually thrive within that platform. You want your developers to be focused on building an application. When they build the application, they're working on the platform. So if you think about it, like the application runs on top of the platform. The developers are operating with or working within that platform without actually having to think about being in that platform. Like it's a very, very important distinction to make, is that developers shouldn't actually be aware they're working with platform tools. They should just be aware that I'm building, I'm developing. So how do you know you fucked up? Really, it's basically like there's more cognitive overload. You build a solution, suddenly they have to learn a new technology. They have to learn a new tech stack. We're saying like, okay, we're running a bare EC2. Now we want you to run in Kubernetes. I'm like, okay. Developers are like, all right, what do I need to run in Kubernetes? Like, okay, well, you actually need to adopt all these processes. You need to work with all these tools. You need to learn how to write Docker files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You didn't think about the migration path. You're creating an overload for them. Other one is actually, you don't talk to your users. Communication is key to building a platform. When you first start from the very beginning, you actually have to kind of like discuss with them, understand what they're doing. The other one is actually you build technology before they actually need it because you create a vision of like, this is what our platform is going to be, or this will be the tech stack we're going to have in the future. And you start building it when there isn't actually a requirement for it. You kind of have the solution, you're looking for a problem. And then finally, this is one. Actually, yesterday there was a discussion around autonomy. And one person kind of mentioned, like, we always have to wait for the platform to actually respond to our needs. We have to talk for every single solution we're building. And I actually said, like, you don't have a platform team, you just have a service desk. I've seen this when I've kind of stepped into an organization, helped them build out their platform. They had what they call the platform team, and I looked, and it was every single time the development team needed to build a service, they would send a request saying, hey, I need a Lambda function in 3 days. Hey, I need a new container service in 2 days. I need this in 1 day, da-da-da-da. Where I was like, okay, well, how soon do you need it? They're like, well, I was just told that I had to build it now, so I need it now. And that's actually where there was no actual form of a platform there. It was just individuals who were focused on actually taking care of the complexity for the developers, had to actually building in something that was more self-service or enabling. So let's think about like the starter pack. There's a couple of things that I call like the starter pack. The first one is honestly called farming. When you step in somewhere and say we're going to build a platform, or you have an existing team, you're going to say we're going to move over to being a platform, go out there and look at what's being done. You're going to find the shadow ops. And you actually want to talk to the shadow ops. You don't want to go to the shadow ops and say, cut it out. That's not, you shouldn't be doing that. But you want to do is, okay, why did you actually make this choice? Why did you decide to actually build a solution when we had this standard? And they'll often give you really useful feedback that will help you. Other things, like I said, you have to talk to the customers, put them ahead of the process. Because oftentimes the processes may not be helping them, because there is a need for a platform. We just need to understand why it needs to be there. And the other one is actually kind of prioritizing those platform-centric solutions. So it's really, think about, when I build this solution, how many people benefit from it? Oftentimes I've had it basically where a team comes with saying, hey, we need this tool to support us. And we look and we're like, okay, well, that tool only supports you. We kind of looked across the board and actually nobody else benefits from it. That isn't a platform product. We'll give you some advice. There's architecture review, kind of help you make the right choices, but it doesn't make sense to actually own it from a platform side yet. There might be a case where you see things evolve over time. Most importantly, listen. Listen to every single person talking to you. Track those requests. Actually kind of see what's coming through. Because oftentimes people will tell you what they need without realizing what they're actually telling you. There's useful feedback in every bit of data available there. You kind of just need to take the time to actually stop, sit down with people, talk about it, and listen to the feedback and what they're telling you. Oftentimes, it may not be a person. It could be a system. It could be something else. So that means really looking at the metrics. What's your adoption rate? What's your diversity of solutions being built on top of it? And finally, impact. I've seen situations where an organization will kind of start bringing a platform team and saying, okay, we're going to start moving us from Azure to AWS because we see these issues. What's going to happen is it'll basically take a year and a half to build out the new platform. Yes, there is issues with it, but that means that we have to wait a year and a half for us to actually start benefiting from this platform and what's being built out. So as a result, you have to focus on what you have today. Okay, that means looking at your current technology. You may hate it. It might suck a bit. But you want to prioritize how much value you can provide as quickly as possible. Because that's when you prove the viability of the platform. And really, the other thing is also kind of stability. If you see things are unstable, if you see lots of frequent issues, focus on stabilizing things by building those platform solutions. If you see, hey, we have a lot of gaps, we do a release, we don't really understand why features start to kind of suffer. Okay, let's look at the observability stack and see what we can actually improve there. Okay, what things can we build out there? Maybe we just kind of need to standardize how we're actually defining those metrics and those alarms. Do we need to centralize things a little bit there? Okay, that might be working with the current observability tool set that doesn't work as efficiently as we want it to. But that is showing the impact of what happens when you start building the standardization and start centralizing how you operate. And the other thing to do is also don't look too closely at individual problems because you want to kind of start zooming out until you kind of start seeing the ability to provide consistency of processes. And then you can kind of start going deeper. Because oftentimes, as was mentioned earlier, we kind of forget like this human aspect. Okay? The organization wants to change, but they don't want to change at the same time. So actually, oftentimes, you might need to back out a bit, not talk about developers, but actually talk about how the leaders are working together. And then from there, move forward. And finally, don't write lengthy documentation. Focus on the best practices. Because lengthy documentation is visited once, and the best practices are frequently visited. Had a security team that wrote an amazing 20-page document on how to actually protect us from DDoS attacks, from malicious attacks, malicious traffic, everything. They were asking for feedback. Nobody gave them feedback because it was so lengthy. I sat down and read through. It was terrific information there, but it was such a long document that nobody actually really paid attention to it. So if we actually focus on actually providing the best practices, how to get up and running, that will help actually provide more impact, more value to people, because they actually want to understand what's the best way of moving about implementing this process. And then the other thing is, people think that platforms kind of limit you, but actually allows for innovation. Because we see, like, at the beginning, we have a couple of in-house platform solutions. Over time, we see, hey, this SaaS solution actually kind of provides the same features that it replicates our jobs that we need to get done. We can free up capacity to do a POC, to do some experimentation. Over time, this process repeats. It allows you to kind of like move things, into a SaaS. You build your standardization around a SaaS solution, kind of using the automation for the APIs and such. While also kind of like only having things in-house that actually need to be in-house, and allowing you to kind of continue doing experimentation, innovation with your users. And of course, your platform is a product. It's not something you build once. You don't just create it, throw it over the fence, and run away. You're maintaining it. Treat it as a product. You have a product owner. It has jobs to do. It has functions. Think about what you're actually operating with. And regularly review it, because sometimes you'll see your solution isn't really viable anymore. It doesn't really make any sense anymore. Had an organization that built an in-house feature flagging utility. Works really, really well. But it requires somebody to actually maintain it. And that actually took up a lot of capacity. So what happened? They made a decision to move towards a SaaS solution. And at the end, when you're actually empowering the ownership, so I said self-service, actually I hate the word self-service. It's about empowering it, enabling people to actually own the entire process, from basically building, developing, operating, observing it, and going back. As we call it, you build it, you run it. And so in the end, when you have this whole process where you kind of break down this whole organizational structure that limits this agility, so to speak, you end up having happy customers. Thank you.